greatest pleasure in introducing David Bornstein.
Thank you. So, as a journalist, most of my friends, most journalists come off as pretty cynical, but in fact, they went into this work to change the world and to improve the world. And we actually help people understand what the world is. This is what we do every day. But the news has produced such a narrative of brokenness, really over the last 50 years. I mean, this is really what we see. I mean, you see the Twitter feed, you read about what's going on in Washington, or if something blows up. And in fact, we're now contributing, and we have been contributing for a long time, to a lot of fear and anxiety. The United States, the reason why the life expectancy in the United States is going down is because of what they call deaths of despair. Largely addiction, alcohol, suicide. This is the former Surgeon General of the United States talked about an epidemic of loneliness in the country. The biggest health problem in the country is loneliness, and it has the health effects of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day if you're severely lonely. So a lot of this has been contributed to this narrative that journalism has created. And as Larry said, we don't have a language for describing winning, for describing good things other than shutting up. And that's not a good thing. So what we've been trying to do is to create that language, a framework to help people understand what the world is really like, and also how we can talk about things that are positive without coming off as sort of fluffy or Pollyannish, or getting people to lose their sense of urgency. I have been a journalist for almost 30 years, and early in my career I was working for New York Newsday. I covered a lot of murders, and it really depressed me, and I thought I might want to leave journalism. But I switched. I ended up moving into the business of covering international development and really looking at how people around the world were trying to solve social problems. So I spent a year in Bangladesh writing a book looking at how people were providing loans to the poorest people in the world to reduce poverty. And that really had a huge impact on how I saw the poorest people in the world. They were not necessarily just people waiting for Marines to throw rice at them out of helicopters when there was a cyclone. They were very competent people, and they had a lot of agency. I went to India, and I reported on how street kids across India, working with social workers, had created a child protection system that had saved thousands and thousands of young people. This has now become the national system in India. It's called Childline. I went to South Africa, where in the height of AIDS, when there were no antiretroviral drugs, there were not even pain medications in most of the really poor parts of South Africa, youth and nurses had organized this informal palliative care service where they were going to people's houses like this young man and helping them die in a dignified fashion. This later became a model for the entire country, and it changed the accreditation of nurses in South Africa. So it had a really big impact. In Brazil, I went to southern Brazil where people were bringing electricity to people who had never had it through solar and other means. It was transforming people's lives. They didn't have to breathe in smoky air by lighting kerosene. This man felt so blessed by having a solar panel in his house, but that's the battery, that he put a saint on the battery. I went to Hungary, where people were transforming the state's institutions for people with mental and physical disabilities. This is an actual photograph from 2000 about the way people were kept. It's like the Dark Ages. And over the course of time, those facilities became much more humanized, and we were reporting on how they became normalized. And this is a place where everybody works, with a discotheque, with open access. People are not dressed in hospital gowns. And finally, this man here, sitting here, his name is Jim Grant. I wrote about him. He led something called the Child Survival Revolution when he led UNICEF for 15 years in the 80s and mid-90s. Has anyone ever heard of Jim Grant? Yeah. Good. A few people. He may have saved more lives than anyone in history. I mean, by 1995, he had saved at least 25 million lives. The revolution that he had led, and of course it's way more since then. But it's not the sort of person that is in our... We all know who Brett Kavanaugh is, but we don't know who Jim Grant is. And that's a great tragedy. So this is the story that we tell. And journalism doesn't have a language for these stories. It was very, very hard to sell these stories when I was trying to get them into magazines and newspapers. The only place that you can reliably look at these kinds of stories is places like this. Now, CNN Heroes, for those of you who ever watched the show, it's Thanksgiving. It's not really considered real journalism. It's considered sort of seasonal fare. Like, let's make people feel a little bit better before the holidays. But it's not hard news. So this really troubled me. And in 2010, my friend Tina Rosenberg, who's my hero as a journalist, asked me if I wanted to write a column with her in the New York Times that would rigorously report on how people were solving problems. And this was a great opportunity to get it right into the New York Times, right on the op-ed page, or under the op-ed editor. And we started doing that for a few years. And we found, we were reporting on foster care, homelessness, and malaria, and all sorts of things, looking at really creative models that were reducing deaths and illness and suffering in the world. And we found two things. One, there was so many stories that I have a spreadsheet with literally 1,000 story ideas. I mean, I could do this column for the next 20 years and not run out of ideas. So that was the first thing. There's so many of these stories. And the second one was that when we wrote them, they were often on the most emailed list, even when we wrote about homelessness or foster care. And my editor used to say to me, we've never had a story about foster care on the most emailed list. And we'd say, well, that's because you didn't have a story about how people are trying to solve the foster care problem. You always have stories about how bad it is. And so we saw that there was perhaps an opening in journalism because of this myth that people only care about negative news. If it bleeds, it leads. And so together with a bunch of journalists, we decided to start this network called the Solutions Journalism Network to train other news organizations and to show them the possibilities of covering the world through the lens of how are people solving problems. But not through hero worship stories, not through puffy, feel-good stories, but through rigorous investigative journalism that would look at, are these things really working? And if so, what can we learn about them and how can we share those ideas? Surprising to us, it's grown. We've been doing this for 5 years now, and we've now worked with over 170 news organizations around the world. Some of the biggest, like the BBC World Service, as well as really tiny news organizations in red states and red counties in rural areas across the United States. And what we've seen, and we've also trained about 12,000 journalists around the world with curriculum and things that are in 7 languages. And what we've seen very, very strongly is that people deeply want to feel powerful in the world. They want information that helps them understand how do we get through this period in history. And in fact, the #1 predictor of why someone voted for Donald Trump was not race, and it was not age, it was not gender. It was if they answered yes to the statement, people like me have no say. If people felt powerless, they were 90% more likely to vote for Donald Trump, and no more likely to vote for Cruz or Rubio or any of the Democrats. It was the way the RAND Corporation, which did this survey, described it, was they said it was singularly predictive, meaning it was the most important predictive thing. A sense of powerlessness is what led us into this situation. So as journalists, we thought we really contribute to this sense of powerlessness. We tell people every day how terrible everything is, and we never let them know, are there people out there solving these problems, when in fact, as we've discovered through our network, there are thousands and thousands of people solving problems. And as we've trained news organizations to look for these stories, we've started putting them in a database. You can go to this database if you want to find them. We'll have 5,000 stories pretty soon. They're all around the world. I don't know if you can see this is a map of the world. But we're seeing extraordinary things happening in communities around the country, around the world that are completely underreported. Now, I don't want to minimize the problems we have. We have tremendous inequality in the United States. We have an opioid crisis. We have political, a disaster, I would say. But we also can't forget that there's extraordinary resilience and agency scattered around the country and around the world. And if there is hope, it's in those stories. So I wanted to share a bunch of those stories with you to give you a sense of just what's kind of coming up around the world, and also the role that writing about them or telling stories through video or whatever format can have. One of the ways we've convinced journalists to do rigorous reporting about solutions is by telling them this is not about good news. This is about accountability. This is about holding power to account, which is what journalism is supposed to do. So I'll give you an example. We did a project with the Cleveland Plain Dealer that was called Toxic Neglect. And it was about lead paint. And Cleveland has some of the worst lead paint statistics. This is a map of Cleveland, and the red areas on this map indicate where 50% of the children have been exposed to lead paint. Now this is a public health catastrophe. Lead paint is a neurotoxin. It's terrible. The Cleveland Plain Dealer had done this series twice before over in the 10-year period, and they never had any response. They did a big watchdog series, nothing happened. The public officials said, we don't have any money, we don't have resources to solve the problem, and they swept it under the rug and nothing changed. This time we said, why don't we show the government, show the local public health officials that what they're doing, that other cities are doing much, much better than them. And so we helped them develop a model where they started going to other cities and reporting on other cities that had solved their lead paint problem or dramatically reduced lead paint exposure. So this is a story they did where they sent their reporter from Cleveland to Rochester because Rochester had reduced its lead paint exposure by 85 to 90% over a 10-year period. And they wrote a story that we call a how done it. It's like an Agatha Christie story about the mystery of cracking the lead paint problem in Rochester. How did they actually reduce it? What did they do? And it gets very nerdy. It's kind of like one of those TV shows where everybody's looking in microscopes. It's really very much about the details. The difference is that after this series came out, it had an enormous impact on the city. The health director was forced to resign along with a bunch of people on the staff. They hired 7 more people and they started doing the kinds of audits and things that were in the stories. And then the paper was able to keep the pressure on. But in keeping the pressure on, they didn't create fatalism, they didn't create apathy. They created a sense of kind of healthy anger, I would say. Anger that's coupled with, we know we can do better. Rochester's doing better. Minneapolis is doing better. What's wrong with our city? And when you create that kind of pressure, you really actually mobilize people to act. It's very, very different than the kind of news that we get today, which makes people turn their hands up to the sky and feel like the world is going, in a terrible direction. So this is the only slide with words I wanted to have. What we found is that a problem that people used to see as unavoidable, which is sort of despairing and fatalistic, came to be seen as unacceptable. It is unacceptable not to solve our problem because we know it's possible. We've seen other places doing better. And every news organization that has gotten this message and shifted its approach has seen results with it. And the results are social impact, more trust from the audience. They start trusting the news organization because they see they're really helping the community. And actually depolarization. They start seeing that people actually want to talk about problem solving who are on different ends of the red-blue spectrum. So, and the news organizations love this because they really want to get into it. And I just want to share a few graphs about the world to kind of explain what is happening in the world and then share a few more stories. These are 3 really important sort of data points that we don't often realize. Around the world, the life expectancy has dramatically increased everywhere. Every country you have, since 1950, a huge increase in how long people are living. And this is because of improvements in public health and basically water and other things by and large. The other thing, this is not well understood, the other thing is poverty around the world has plummeted. 2015 was the first year in world history when the rate of absolute poverty, which is the most severe metric, dropped below 10%. This is the curve of it. We don't really think about the world as getting better most of the time, but this is a really important thing. And the final thing is this line over here. These all come from Oxford University by a wonderful website called Our World in Data that a person named Max Roser runs. In 1960, the world literacy rate was about 40%, and today, in 2010, it was 82%, and it continues to rise. Now, by the way, this is there's more gender parity in this number. That means that 80% of women are girls and 80% of boys too. It's becoming more equal along the gender lines too. Now this is people living longer, being less poor, and knowing how to read. It's a very, very different world, and it's a story that, in fact, I would say you could read the newspaper every day for 50 years and you probably wouldn't realize those things are happening. So, what are the results of some of these things when they're happening? Well, this is a story from The Guardian. We've worked with them from a wonderful section called The Upside, which is looking at solutions around the world. Reporting on 1,100 villages in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, where maternal mortality has dropped by 90% and infant mortality has dropped by 60%. And it's happening because educated women are becoming local health workers and essentially helping their neighbors to have safer births. Now that's a story that is extraordinarily important, but you kind of have to hunt for it. We're now trying to get, places like The Guardian and other places to be telling these stories all the time. I don't know if you remember this story from a couple of years ago when it was going to be the end of civilization. We were going to shut down the borders and Ebola was going to... what happened, right? It was stopped. I would venture to say you could ask 1,000 people if they heard about the Ebola crisis, and all of them would put up their hands and ask them if they know how it was stopped, and nobody would put up their hand, right? So this is crazy. This is like we slayed a dragon. Let's not tell anyone about it, right? This is just from 3 months ago, from this summer, July. There was another Ebola outbreak, right? It was stopped with 29 deaths because of probably the quickest development of a vaccine in human history. Extraordinarily creative scientists, very, very courageous health workers, and now that story is beginning to get out. And that's a really powerful story. It builds trust and faith in institutions, and it helps us know what we can expect from our governments and from our public health institutions. Here's another story. Malawi, one of a very poor country in Africa, I don't know if it's one of the poorest, the restoration of its forests. This is a country that was almost completely deforested because everybody chopped down the trees for firewood, and now the forests are starting to come back. And they're coming back because smart people are doing things. They're giving people water filters so they don't have to burn so much wood to boil water, cook stoves that use a lot less energy and use alternative fuels, and they're planting millions and millions of trees. And they expect that in the next 20 years they might completely reforest the country. So this is a wonderful story from Iceland where and you see these kinds of stories happening all around the world now, where they're training young boys essentially to not grow up with the same old gender stereotypes, right? So these are the boys, every morning, this is in a preschool, this is across the country, the boys meet each other, they make eye contact, they talk about their friendship. There's a whole curriculum around caring and nurturing. And this is Iceland's essentially response to Me Too. We have to begin with these gender stereotypes and expectations. What is it to be masculine or what is it to be feminine? Very young. We've seen programs like this in Egypt, all across the developing world, and in the United States increasingly. This is another side of probably the same story. Arkansas is the first state in the nation to mandate that every trucker has to take a course in identifying sexual trafficking, because a lot of the sexual trafficking happens at truck stops. And in fact, 1 in 11 people in Arkansas works in the trucking industry. So this is a really, really effective way. More than 1,000 people have been rescued nationally through this model, Truckers Against Trafficking, and it's working in a number of states. But Arkansas is actually the first state to say that everyone has to go through this course to learn how to identify how to help young women if they see them at a truck stop. This is kind of interesting. Milwaukee was trying to figure out, Milwaukee had the worst rate of police treatment of people with mental health. Police were just arresting people for the crime of being schizophrenic or having some other mental illness. So this article was actually in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, but the picture is actually from Houston, Texas. They sent a reporter to Houston because Houston, believe it or not, has the best program in the country for training police to be sensitive to mental illness. And so they went to Houston to bring back that model to Milwaukee. something that you probably wouldn't expect. Here's another interesting story. We know about the crisis of immigration with the Trump administration's policies. They're rounding up family separation, children separated from their families. There's a whole bunch of cities across the United States, including cities with Republican governments. This is like Poughkeepsie, for example, which has a Republican mayor, are issuing municipal IDs to immigrants, undocumented immigrants, in order for them to be able to deal with the police, pick up their children from school, go to a doctor, apply for housing, all of these things. They can get municipal IDs, and in most cases, they're protected. Their information is protected and kept private, so they're not in danger through this process of being exposed to ICE, for example. Here's another interesting unknown. Tennessee, the Tennessee Promise is something that, has anyone heard of the Tennessee Promise? So Tennessee is the first state in the United States that guarantees that every young person who graduates from high school gets a free college education, free community college education. As long as you graduate, it doesn't matter what your GPA is, as long as you graduate from high school and you enroll the following fall, the state will pay for free community college. And now other states are looking at the Tennessee Promise to see if this could work for them. So this was an article that was actually in the Seattle Times saying, hey, let's copy what Tennessee is doing and let's do that in Washington State. This is, I thought, a really fascinating story. It's from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. I don't know if many of you have read about it, but Minneapolis has one of the largest Somali communities in the United States. And for a couple of years ago, they had a real crisis because it was the #1 recruiting community for ISIS. There were quite a number of young people that were going off to Syria to fight with ISIS, and it created enormous tensions in the state. There was a stabbing, and there was real racial violence that was coming out of this. So the Star-Tribune decided to figure out what's the best thing in the world to reduce radicalization of youth. And they found that, in fact, the best model was in Denmark, a place called Aarhus, Denmark. So they actually sent a reporter there to figure out what are the police doing in Aarhus that prevents the youth there from being radicalized. And then they brought that model back to Minneapolis. They shared it widely in the city. They also shared it in the Somali community. They translated all these articles in Somali to make sure that this is not being done to your community, but with your community. And it led to a whole bunch of reforms, including $2 million in new youth center programming for the area in Minneapolis called Little Mogadishu, which is where the Somali community is concentrated. So this is really an extraordinary difference in how you cover this issue, rather than just reporting on the crime or the problem, whatever. I mentioned before that there is sort of a crisis of loneliness in the United States. The former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has gone around the country giving a very powerful speech. What we're now seeing in many, many parts of the world is a lot more attention to this problem. Like, for example, England now has a Minister of Happiness. I don't know if this will work, but it was created to combat this problem of loneliness. We also see a lot of communities around the United States now that are really focusing on well-being. They're saying we have to create new meeting spaces for our community. There's a whole bunch of efforts around the United States to create improved transport options for older people so that they can get out more easily, including very low cost or free services. But this issue is, I would say we probably have seen 50 or 60, probably more than that, probably like 80 or 90 stories coming from our network about communities that are doing something smart to reduce loneliness. And this is just, this is, in a way, it's a kind of a sense of the adaptive resilience of the society, recognizing a problem and then figuring out what to do about it. And a lot of this is completely under the radar. You wouldn't have really heard about this in the mainstream news, except for once in a while you see stories. These are often very, very local stories that come at the community level. I did one of these stories too in my column in the Times. I thought that this was one of the stories that I found most moving. We've done 500 of these columns that look at solutions. This was a story that I wrote about a community one of the poorest communities in Washington State, a community called the Highlands, which is in southwestern Washington State, where people were so scared and so despairing that most of the residents I spoke to said they rarely left their house after 6 p.m. They were scared. And I spoke to them, and I was reporting on it because the community had gotten safer, the crime had gone down, health statistics had gone up, poverty had actually, there was indications that the economy was getting better. And I asked the community, well, what happened? And it all began when the community hired what they called a community coach. A person whose job was to coach people to come together and solve their problems together. When the coach started going door to door saying, what do you need? The first thing people said is, we want to fix the light bulbs on all the porches because it's so dark. We want to get rid of the rabid dogs, the stray dogs that are scaring us. We want to clean up the garbage from people who just left their yards. And we want to build a walking path. And so the coach pulled the people together, started working with the council, and then the community itself created its own community council. And after the coach left, 3 years later, the community continued to do these things on its own. Not quite as well, I have to say. But it's a really interesting idea, the community coach building, reducing loneliness, helping people see how they can kind of do a barn raising in their community, so to speak. We hear a lot about communities across the United States and racial profiling with police and excessive use of force. We know that this is a huge problem. There's actually quite a lot of police forces around the country very quietly doing things differently, both in terms of reducing the use of force, but also responding to people with addiction and other issues, rather than just sort of throwing them into jail through a more compassionate approach. So this is a story from Western Massachusetts, a bunch of police departments, but we've seen this in probably about 50 cities and towns across the country, a much more compassionate and wise response to the opioid crisis and other addictions. And then I'm just going to end with one last story. This is one of my favorite news organizations in the United States. It's called the Richland Source. It's tiny. It's in central Ohio. It's a Trump county, 70% Trump voters in this county. Very poor. It's one of the poorest counties in the state. Had one of the highest infant mortality rates in the state as well. And so the Richland Source did a whole series on what works to keep children healthy. How do we reduce infant mortality? How do we improve child development statistics and so forth? And the reporting was just wonderful. But after they did the report, they realized it's not enough to just send out these stories and kind of hope people read them. We need to actually make sure people are understanding these things in their hearts. So the newspaper decided to throw a baby shower, community baby shower. And the investigative journalists, when we first, when they first tabled this idea, they were sort of horrified. They're like, this is not our job, this is advocacy, this is... But eventually, the publisher was so adamant that they did it, and it was one of the best things they ever did. Now they do these things all the time. They had hundreds of people who came, lines around the block, like for Star Wars movies, and people created these new relationships. And they also got the information through face-to-face encounter with community health workers and all sorts of... the Richland Source has now done this around how do we care for our elders, how do we build a post-Rust Belt economy. They're just going very, very deep on this. And the publisher, a few months ago, decided to see if the community would give them the money to do it, saying, hey, do you like what we're doing? And so this was the story. They were floored. They got $70,000. Remember, this is not New York. This is one of the poorest communities in Ohio. $70,000 from the local community to support the solutions journalism work. And this was like their headline, we are floored by the community, right? So people deeply need a sense of agency and efficacy, and it's encouraging. This is a movement that's changing journalism, we think. We're hopeful. It's moving not fast enough, but I think we're making headway. And there are ways to find these stories. You can find them if you go to the BBC World Hacks, The Guardian, Upside, our column, Fixes in the New York Times, the Solutions Journalism Story Tracker, where you can find 5,000 stories. and other places. And hopefully this will continue to grow. And I just want to end with a quote. As a journalist, we're supposed to be in the lighting business, we're not supposed to be in the heating business. We're supposed to, shine a spotlight but not make you angry. We're not supposed to affect your emotions too much. That's not our job, to make you angry or to inspire you or to give you hope. But it's kind of silly that most journalists would feel like it's not our job to be in the hope business. So I was hunting around for a definition of hope that's rigorous enough that we could actually share with journalists without them throwing us out of the room. And this one sort of came across as the most powerful one. Hope is a belief in the plausibility of the possible. What's possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable, as opposed to believing that what's likely has to happen. That we can always change the direction. So I'll pause there. I thank you so much for inviting me, and do we have time for some questions? Or?
We have a couple of questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
I was very interested, Larry, and you were talking about the negativity bias in the beginning, and I wanted to hear David's thoughts about how this impacts that. And as a former journalist, there's always this feeling that we need to be right, not necessarily in community. And I think those are right, not in community, meaning in community with what everybody else believes is true. We as journalists are holding the beacon to show people what's true and right, and they're not listening. And we're not in their community. We're outsiders exposing what's wrong with their community.
There's two questions there. The negativity bias is the belief that if something bad happens, it's news, but if someone improves things, it's not news. And that just comes from an old assumption that's like 100 years old. There's a phrase in journalism or a phrase that's often cited in journalism: sunlight is the best disinfectant. It comes from Louis Brandeis. He said it 100 years ago. There's the Sunlight Foundation, which is a big foundation for investigative journalism. It's only half an analogy. That's the issue. The truth is we only need antibiotics a few days a year. Most of the time, it's our immune system. We need antibodies 365 days a year. And so you don't only have to disinfect, you also have to strengthen the antibodies as well. And helping journalists realize that there are those two roles is what's happening. The belief that bad news sells better than good news is true, but news about how people are solving problems is essentially news about ideas. It's about knowledge. That does better than bad news. Most of our news organizations have more time on page and more shares of solution stories compared to comparable non-solution stories. So that's a big, and that's a very important thing for the market.
I have some here.
Dave, thanks for this great presentation.
Can you stand up? Yeah. And then you can
I'd like to thank you for this presentation. I think we're surrounded by so many journalists here, and I just wanted to touch upon your opinion. How did people like Alex Jones and this media, fake news, get so popularized? I just heard this morning that Apple delisted them in the media, and I want to get your opinion on, I come across this and I said, well, where are these people coming from? And how do they get their popularization since you're a journalist?
I don't know if anyone really knows the exact answer to that. I'll tell you what I do know from our network is that there's this false belief that people trust you because they think you're accurate. That's part of it. We want the people that we're listening to be right. But actually, people trust you because they think you have their backs. People trust you because they think you care about them. It's kind of like that phrase, I don't care what you know until I know that you care. What has happened in journalism is that a whole bunch of people on the right have gotten a bunch of people to feel that we really care about you, so trust us. It doesn't matter what we say about global warming, it doesn't matter about what we say about almost anything, we are actually talking about the reality from your perspective. So when journalists actually go into a community and they start saying, you have these problems, we have considered it our job not just to tell you how terrible things are, but to find information that can help our community become what we want to become. The trust begins to go up. And I think that's how we're going to fight back against misinformation and the Alex Joneses and lots and lots of examples of what we call fake news. Not by putting a fact check tag next to every story, but by genuinely showing that we're in a relationship with you. Because trust is a function of relationship. Would you have one more question?
Last question.
Okay. Yeah, your hand up.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. I've been hearing over the years and reading more about a lot of the resolutions that are coming come from religious organizations. And part of that is also attached to proselytizing. And I didn't see in your presentation the religious side of it, but from my understanding, a lot of the direction by governments and municipalities is being given to in the laps of religious organizations to handle, and less is being taken upon by governments and by ethical secular organizations such as this one. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that as well over the years and with the direction being given inadvertently or consciously by governments.
That's such an interesting question. I would have to look for that. I don't know the answer to that if we're seeing that. But I can ask the editors around the country that we work with if they're seeing that. Sorry. Thank you very much.